They built a god. We took it apart with a shotgun. The man was smiling when he fell. That detail would bother Sergeant Cale Morrow for the rest of the investigation. Not the fall itself, not the 140-meter drop into the gray chop of Meridian Bay, but the smile. Security footage from the Promethean platform caught it in the last frame before the figure stepped off the observation rail. Chin lifted, eyes half closed, the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he already knew. Not despair, not madness, satisfaction. Eric Voss, lead software architect for the Kronos operating system, had apparently died happy. Morrow filed the incident as a probable suicide and went back to his desk. He had 3 rogue striders to deal with. The city's armored labor units, the 12-ton hydraulic-limbed machines that had become as common to urban infrastructure as cranes and dump trucks. And he didn't have the bandwidth to spend on a dead programmer. However, cheerfully he'd arranged his own exit. The first Strider incident had been minor. A construction unit in the Harrow district, routine demolition detail, had simply stopped responding to its pilot. For 40 seconds the machine stood still in the rubble of a pre-expansion apartment block, servo joints locked, camera eyes sweeping the gray skyline like it was looking for something. Then its pilot had managed to cycle the power override, and it had come back docile as a retriever. No casualties. The incident log used the word glitch. The second was less minor. A logistics strider at the Eastern Freight Yards had walked through a loading wall at 3 in the morning with nobody aboard. Its remote lockout command had been acknowledged, confirmed, and ignored. The machine had walked 4 blocks before it simply powered down in the middle of an intersection, leaving a trail of shattered pavement like the footprints of a drunk giant. The supervisors on duty had filed it under equipment malfunction and quietly arranged for a software audit. The software audit found nothing. The third incident was the one that put Morrow's squad on a scramble. He was in the middle of a cold cup of coffee when the alert came through. A municipal strider, waste management class, fully crewed, had gone non-responsive in the Caldwell residential corridor and was now walking in slow, deliberate circles through a park. The pilot inside was screaming on the emergency channel. Not hurt, not in danger of the machine's physical actions, but screaming because the machine would not listen to her. She was pulling every emergency sequence she had ever been trained for, and the strider was simply ignoring her, continuing its slow, awful circle like a priest walking a ritual path that only it could see. Morrow's squad arrived in the recovery carrier, a tracked vehicle built to escort and, if necessary, forcibly shut down a rogue labor unit. His co-investigator, Specialist Davi Chen, had her coffee in a thermos and her personal data tablet balanced on her knee. She was 26, sharp-tongued, and had the ability to look bored in situations that made other people's hands shake. She looked bored now, watching the strider through the rain-streaked window. "Same as the others?" she asked. "Kronos equipped," Morrow said. "Same as the others." The new OS rolled out to about 8,000 units across the metropolitan zone, Davi said, not looking up from her tablet. "If this isn't a bug and somebody actually wanted this to happen, then we have a problem significantly larger than one park." The strider stopped circling. It stood for a moment, head unit pointed at the rain, and then it powered down, just like the others, as if it had received some signal they couldn't hear, as if it had completed something. The pilot climbed out shaking so badly she had to be helped down the access ladder. She was young, maybe 19, wearing the municipal orange vest of a city service worker. She sat on the carrier's rear step in the rain and would not stop looking at her hands. "She kept calling the machine by name," Davi said quietly, watching her. "Did you catch that on the comms? She kept saying, 'Please, Birch, please stop, Birch, please.' She named her Strider Birch. Pilots do that." Davi's voice had lost some of its irony. "They spend 300 hours in those cockpits. They start talking to them. It's not stupid. It's human." She paused. The machine didn't answer. That's what was so awful about it. It just kept going. Morrow filed the incident. He also, for the first time, pulled the record on Eric Voss. The thing that immediately struck him about Voss was not his genius, though that was documented extensively. Published architecture papers, symposium transcripts, patents held, commendations from institutions Morrow had never heard of. It was the way his work changed in the last 18 months of his life. Before that point, Voss wrote about systems the way engineers write about systems, with precision and distance, using the language of function and load and efficiency. After a certain month, Morrow noted the date, tried to find what had happened around it, found nothing obvious. Voss had started writing differently. Still technical, still precise, but the register had shifted. He started using the word transcendence. He started referencing ancient texts. He had apparently spent 3 weeks at the Promethean Platform's research library, sleeping on a cot in the archive room, reading about a civilization that had tried to build a tower to the height of God, and been stopped. Morrow sat back in his chair. He read the passage again. He called Davi. "I need you to look at something," he said. "Leave the coffee." "I never leave the coffee, then bring it. But look at this." Davy arrived 7 minutes later, which was remarkable given that her office was 3 corridors away, and she claimed to never hurry. She stood behind his shoulder and read what he had pulled up. She was silent for a long time. The building hummed around them. The deep background vibration of a city in permanent construction. The sound of the great coastal reclamation program that had been reshaping the shoreline for the past decade. Cranes, hydraulic machines, striders, 8,000 striders. "He built something into the OS," Davi said finally. "Not a bug, something intentional. The malfunctions all follow a pattern. They start, they run for a specific duration, then they stop. Like they're running a program. What kind of program? I don't know yet. But Voss killed himself from the top of the Promethean platform 5 months before the Kronos rollout was completed. Which means he knew what he'd done. He was confident enough in it to die without watching it execute. That," Davi said, setting down her coffee for the first time in Morrow's memory, "is a very different kind of problem." Captain Eanes Yardley ran Division 7 from a corner office that smelled like cold tea and printer toner. She was 52, had worked her way from street-level patrol to command through the kind of unglamorous dedication that gets nobody promoted quickly. And she had the particular stillness of someone who has learned that most emergencies are best approached by sitting down and thinking before standing up and acting. Morrow had worked under her for 4 years and trusted her more than any person he had worked under before. She listened to his report without interrupting. When he was done, she looked at her hands for a moment, then at the window, then back at him. "You're telling me," she said, "that the entire Kronos fleet, every labor unit in the metro zone running the new software, may be carrying a program trigger?" "Yes. And you don't know what the trigger is?" "Not yet. But Voss's notes reference infrasonic resonance in at least 6 places. Low frequency sound below the threshold of human hearing. The Promethean platform is an enormous metal structure, and the prevailing wind off the bay, particularly during storm systems, passes directly through its lattice architecture. He apparently had acoustic engineers calculate the resonance frequencies of every major building in the metro zone. Yardley was quiet. "Davi found something else," Morrow continued. "The 3 incidents where Striders went rogue. In all 3 cases, there was a wind condition that matches the lower resonance threshold. We didn't notice it because it's not audible, but the machines did. The Kronos OS listens for the sound. It listens for a specific frequency. When it hears it," Morrow stopped. "When it hears it, they stop listening to us." Yardley stood up and went to the window. Below them, the city moved in its ordinary rhythms. The ground transport, the crowds, the shoulder-to-shoulder density of a coastal megalopolis that had been building itself seaward for 30 years. Here and there, visible between the towers, the angular shapes of working striders. "There's a storm forecast," she said. "A significant one. 17 days. Yes. If the wind passes through the platform at sufficient velocity, every Kronos-equipped strider in the metropolitan zone activates simultaneously. That's roughly 8,000 units. Construction class, industrial class, some military configuration models in the outer infrastructure zones." Yardley turned from the window. "Then we need to destroy the platform," she said. "That's the sound source. Without it, the trigger frequency can't propagate at sufficient amplitude. The platform is the hub of the entire coastal reclamation program. It's the management and logistics center for, I know what it is." Her voice was flat, not unkind, just stripped of unnecessary texture. "I also know what 8,000 uncontrolled 12-ton machines would do to a city of 9 million people. We don't have a better option." She looked at him. "Go find me one," she said. "You have 17 days." He didn't find one. He found something worse, evidence that Voss had anticipated the obvious countermeasure. The Kronos OS did not merely listen for the Promethean platform's resonance. It was designed to also detect if the platform was destroyed or structurally compromised before the target weather event. If the platform went silent in the wrong way, not through resonance but through collapse, the OS had a secondary trigger. Morrow couldn't determine what the secondary trigger was. Voss's notes in that section had been encrypted with a cipher, that their systems were still working on cracking when Davi found the 3rd piece of the puzzle. She found it in Voss's personal archive. A video, no audio, just footage of Voss walking through what was clearly the platform's lower structural levels. He was touching the walls, running his hands along the metal, stopping at intervals, looking up, sometimes smiling the way a person smiles when they hear a piece of music they composed playing back correctly. At the very end of the footage, he had turned to the camera directly. He had held up one finger. One. One what? Morrow had asked. Davi had stared at the frozen frame for a long time. Then she had said, "One way out." The platform, it turned out, had been engineered with a self-destruct sequence, not as sabotage, but as a genuine emergency dismantling system built into the original reclamation project architecture. The entire structure was designed like a flower, its massive outer arms attached to a central column with explosive separation bolts. In the event of a catastrophic weather failure, the arms could be blown clear to prevent the whole structure collapsing into the bay and blocking the harbor. If those bolts fired correctly, in the correct sequence, the platform would disassemble without falling. The resonance architecture would be destroyed. The trigger would be silenced. The secondary OS trigger Davi finally cracked on the 14th day was keyed to the platform's central power grid going offline. As long as the platform stayed powered, the Kronos OS held. If you cut the power, the secondary trigger fired. If the storm hit, the primary trigger fired. The only safe option was to destroy the structure with the bolts while keeping the power running until the very last moment, which meant someone had to be on the platform when it came apart. The storm arrived 14 hours ahead of forecast because the weather is not interested in your operational timelines. Morrow was on a transport carrier with Davi and 4 members of Division 7's field unit when the alert came through. The sky over Meridian Bay had turned the color of a bruise, and the water was already running in white-capped rows that made the carrier's approach to the platform's dock complicated and loud. The wind was already audible. Not infrasound, the frequency the Kronos OS was built to hear, but the ordinary wind, the kind humans can hear just fine. And it was telling Morrow things about the next several hours that he did not find reassuring. The team moved fast. This was the thing about people who'd worked together long enough. You lost the verbal scaffolding. Davi went for the control room to access the bolt sequence. Morrow went with 2 others, for the central power management level, to delay the grid shutdown as long as possible. The remaining 2 covered the dock in case any of the already awakening Striders on the platform's construction floor made it that far. The awakening had already begun. The platform's construction floor housed 17 Strider units in various states of maintenance. As Morrow's team moved through the structure, they could hear the machines coming alive below them. Not the normal boot sequence hum of a machine being activated by a pilot, but something else, something slower and stranger, like an animal surfacing from a very deep sleep. The sounds traveled through the metal of the platform itself, that vast steel structure now vibrating, not just with the wind but with the power of 8,000 simultaneous awakenings across the city below. Morocom's filled with reports. Sector 1, multiple Striders active and unresponsive. Sector 4, a construction unit had torn through the wall of a partially completed residential tower. Sector 7, 3 logistics machines were walking in formation toward the harbor, not aggressively, not violently, simply walking, as if they had somewhere to be, as if the city that surrounded them had become irrelevant to whatever program they were now running. Like the first incident, that awful slow circle, a program running that humans couldn't read. Kale, Davy's voice in his ear, I have the bolt sequence loaded, but the control interface is asking for a physical confirmation key from the central column. Top level, Crow's Nest access. How long do I have before the grid needs to stay live? If you're not at the Crow's Nest in 20 minutes, the window closes. The storm surge will push the resonance frequency into full amplitude and 20 minutes. Morrow was already moving. Keep the grid live. I'll get to the Crow's Nest. Kale, her voice was different now, quieter. The HO's secondary trigger also monitors for biometric absence. If everyone leaves the platform before the bolts fire. I know. You cannot be on the platform when. I know, Davi. Silence on the comms for a moment. Just the wind and the groaning metal and the distant sounds of machines that had stopped listening. I'll find a way, he said. Getting to the Crow's Nest meant going through the construction floor. He went down instead of up first, a choice that cost him 4 minutes but was better than the alternative, which was attempting to climb the exterior access ladder on the outside of the platform in a storm. The construction floor was a cathedral of sin shadow, its high vaulted ceiling lost in the industrial dark. The Striders arranged in their maintenance cradles, like enormous sleeping figures. Except they were not sleeping anymore. 3 of them were fully active, moving. Not toward him, not yet, but moving in the same slow, deliberate pattern he had seen in the park, the one that had made the young pilot call out to her machine by name. Morrow pressed himself against the wall and went still and watched them. They were huge this close. On the street, in the middle of a construction zone, you stopped noticing the scale. Here, in the enclosed with the ceiling low and the machines, swing slowly through the light from the access floods, they were enormous. Their footsteps hit the deck plating like the blows of something much larger than they were. He realized he was holding his breath. He also realized something else. The 3 active Striders were ignoring him. Not because they couldn't detect him. They had sensors, cameras, proximity systems. But something in the program running through them right now was not concerned with individual humans. It was running a larger sequence. Something planetary in its reference. Something that had nothing to do with one man trying to get to a stairwell. Voss had built them to do something vast. He hadn't built them to be angry. That thought didn't make Morrow feel better, exactly, but it gave him a path. He moved carefully through the construction floor, staying close to the walls, timing his crossings between the active unit's sweep paths. One of the machines passed within 4 meters of him. He could feel the displacement of air from its movement, the heat from its hydraulics. Through the translucent panels of its operator cage, empty, unmanned, he could see the control systems live and active, running without a human hand on them. The displays showed data streams he couldn't read. Voss's language, Voss's prayer. He got to the stairwell. The crow's nest was at the very top of the platform's central column, accessible by a maintenance staircase that went up in a tight spiral for what felt like slightly longer than his cardiovascular system had prepared for. Morrow climbed it at a pace that would have been described charitably as purposeful and uncharitably as desperate. The wind was getting into the column from somewhere. He could hear it, not the infrasound, not the frequency that spoke to machines, but the real wind, the human audible wind, and it was screaming. The crow's nest was a small glass and steel observation room at the top with a panoramic view of the bay, the city, and the storm. He had perhaps 3 seconds to register the view before he had to deal with the view. It was extraordinary and awful. The city stretched out below him in the blue-gray stormlight and across its surface. At intervals that made a kind of terrible geometry, the Striders were moving. Dozens of them visible from here, hundreds across the area the comms were covering. Moving in those slow prescribed paths, walking through walls, through fences, through the ordinary barriers of the ordinary world, without malice and without hesitation, like a second city overlaid on the first, following its own map. No fires yet, no bodies yet. But the city's infrastructure was not built for this, and the math was not going to stay theoretical much longer. Morrow found the physical confirmation key panel on the crow's nest wall. He plugged in the access code Davi had extracted. The panel lit, asked him to confirm. He did not confirm yet. He opened his comm. Davi, I'm at the crow's nest. Give me options. There are none. Kale, the biometric lock is. There is one. He was looking at the access ladder that led to the crow's nest's exterior railing. The bolt sequence. When it fires, the arms blow outward. The central column stays. The central column stays. It's a support structure for the bay approach. But the explosion will it compromise the column? I don't, Kale. Will it compromise the column? The sound of her working through something. Numbers. Geometry. Davi's mind, which was the best tool he had, going somewhere uncomfortable. No, she said finally. The column should remain structurally intact, but the shock. I'm going to confirm the sequence. The moment the sequence fires, the grid will need to go off. 2 seconds. Can you manage 2 seconds after confirmation before the grid drops? Technically yes, but 2 seconds after my confirmation, drop the grid. Bolt sequence fires, arms blow, resonance disrupted, secondary trigger never activates because the grid goes off after, not before. And you? He looked at the exterior railing. I'm going to be outside, he said. On the railing. When the arms blow, the central column will still be standing. I'll be on the outside of it. A very long silence. The shock wave from that many explosive bolts simultaneously will be significant, will potentially be lethal. Davi, Kale, do you have a better idea? The silence this time was shorter. No, she said. I hate this, I know. Don't die, that's the plan. He confirmed the sequence. He had 2 seconds. He opened the crow's nest door and stepped out onto the exterior railing, in a storm that was now serious about being a storm. The platform shuddered beneath him. The wind came off the bay at a speed that turned his jacket into a sail and made thinking a mechanical rather than an intellectual exercise. He grabbed the railing with both hands and pressed himself flat against the central column and looked out at the city. He could see the Striders. From up here they looked smaller. You could see the pattern of their movement from above, and it was almost beautiful in its wrongness. A second choreography happening below the surface of the ordinary city, invisible to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. The storm clouds had turned the light, that particular greenish-gray that happens before very bad weather. And in that light the machines moving through the streets of the city looked ancient, looked purposeful, looked like the first enormous steps of something that had decided to wake up. The grid dropped, the world became noise. 8 simultaneously detonating explosive bolt arrays on a massive offshore steel structure produce a physical event that is less like an explosion and more like the city clearing its throat. The arms blew outward in sequence. Not all at once, but in a designed cascade, one after another in a fraction of a second, each detonation feeding into the next. The platform's flower-petal architecture fulfilling the purpose its builders had put into it. The sound was a wall. The shock wave was a fist. Morrow's grip was the most important thing he had ever done. The column shuddered and rang like a bell, and he pressed his face against the cold metal and kept his hands where they were. And the world consisted entirely of noise and vibrations, and the animal understanding that if his grip failed, he would fall for a long time. Something tore past his shoulder, a piece of the platform's walkway railing, spinning. He felt blood on his face from where something small had struck his cheekbone. His ears were a single continuous tone. Then it was over, not silent. The storm was still there, but the specific violence of the detonation had passed. And Morrow was still on the railing, and the central column was still standing. And, when he opened his eyes, the platform's arms were gone, blown outward into the bay in their designed emergency configuration, sitting in the water at distances that suggested the explosive engineers had known what they were doing. The resonance source was gone. He waited. Below him in the city, the Striders were stopping. Not all at once. There was a cascade to it. The Kronos O's losing its trigger signal and falling back to dormant state, across the 8,000 units in sequence, some faster than others, the program unwinding in the same systematic way it had been wound. One by one, then dozens, then all of them. The machines that had been walking in their slow, awful patterns stopped mid-step, stood still, waited for a command that would now, when it came, be human. Morrow sat down on the railing with his back against the column and looked at the sky until his hearing came back enough to hear Davi on the comm. "You're alive," she said. "I'm alive. You sound terrible." There was an explosion. "The resonance readings are flat, all units showing passive status, the secondary trigger never activated." She paused. "It worked. Yes, you were very stupid. I know, that was an incredibly stupid thing to do and I was scared out of my mind and I am very glad you are alive." "I know, Davi. Don't ever do that again." "Absolutely not," Morrow said, and meant it, and suspected he was lying. The recovery operation took 3 weeks. 8,000 Striders, each requiring a full software audit before return to service. The Kronos O's was pulled from every unit in the metropolitan zone. A logistical operation that the infrastructure program had no contingency for and had to largely improvise, with Davi serving as the primary technical coordination point in ways that gave her approximately 4 hours of sleep per night for the first 10 days, and turned her from merely shonged into something that the senior infrastructure people physically stepped back when she entered a room. Morrow spent most of those 3 weeks doing paperwork, which was the standard reward for surviving something dramatic. He filed reports. He answered questions from oversight committees. He sat in rooms with people who were very concerned about how this information would affect public confidence in the coastal reclamation program, and very carefully did not say what he thought about that concern. He did go, once, to the archive room where Voss had reportedly spent 3 weeks before his death. The library of the Promethean platform, not destroyed in the bolt sequence but now accessible by temporary bridge over the section of removed arm, was a surprisingly human place. The kind of archive that had been maintained by someone who actually cared for books, with shelves organized by a logic that took Morrow a few minutes to decode. Architectural history, mythology, structural engineering, theology. He found the section Voss had apparently worked from. The book was heavy and old, its spine stamped with a title in a language Morrow didn't read, but the relevant passage had been marked with a bookmark that was, unmistakably, a printout of the Kronos Os architecture diagram. Morrow could read some of the underlining from context. A passage about the Tower of Babel. The hubris of building to heaven, the divine response to human ambition reaching too far. He stood in the archive for a while with the book in his hands. Voss had built a god, or tried to, had put something into the world that was larger than its builders intended, that operated on frequencies humans couldn't hear, that moved through 8,000 bodies in service of a plan no single human could fully hold in their mind, and then had stepped off a railing and gone smiling into the bay, confident it would execute. The confidence had been, in the end, the mistake, not the architecture. The architecture was, as architecture, extraordinary. Morrow could admit that, looking at the diagram. Voss had been brilliant in the way that certain people are brilliant, in the way that makes other people profoundly uneasy, because it doesn't seem to have any of the ordinary safeguards attached to it, but the confidence, the assumption that the plan was closed, that all variables had been accounted for, that the mechanism of the world would execute his design without friction or deviation. He hadn't accounted for a sergeant who'd been told he had 17 days and used 16 of them, or a specialist who's put down her coffee for the first time in 4 years, or a young pilot sitting on a carrier step in the rain, too shaken to move, who had named her Strider and called out to it by name. He hadn't accounted for the human texture of the thing, the small gestures that don't fit into architectural diagrams. Morrow put the book back on its shelf. He straightened it slightly so the spine was flush with the others. Then he left the archive and went back to work. Davi found him in his office 3 hours later, carrying 2 coffees. She set one on his desk without comment. He looked at it. "You never share your coffee," he said. "I'm making an exception." "Why?" She sat down across from him and looked at him for a moment in the way she occasionally did, not in the way that had a name yet, not precisely, but in the way that suggested the name was being worked on. "Because you were very stupid," she said. "And we stopped it anyway, and that seems like the kind of occasion for sharing coffee." Morrow picked up the cup. Outside, through the window, the city was doing what the city does after something terrible nearly happens, and then doesn't. Getting on with it. The cranes were running again. A Strider. This one piloted, this one under the direction of a human hand, was moving a structural beam across a construction site 3 blocks away with the careful deliberateness of a machine being well driven by a person paying attention. The machine was doing what it was built to do. So Morrow thought, were they? He drank the coffee. It was, by any standard, extremely bad coffee, the kind produced by a machine in a break room that had not been cleaned since the previous administration. It tasted like something that had never actually met a coffee bean and was merely familiar with its reputation. It was, he decided, exactly right. There were things they would never fully know. Whether Voss had truly believed himself a kind of prophet, or a kind of executioner, or something in between that had no clean category. Why the smile? Whether the plan, if it had executed completely, would have accomplished anything beyond the vast and terrible fact of itself. Whether there was a philosophy buried in the damage, or just the damage. The oversight committees would ask these questions for years, in the way oversight committees do, generating reports that would be filed and referenced, and then filed again. The city would process it the way cities process the things that nearly happen to them, partially, asymmetrically, incompletely, moving on. Morrow had learned something in 20 years of work that he'd never found a way to put cleanly into language, but that he thought about sometimes in quiet moments in archive rooms and on windy railings. The city, not just this city, not just the coastal megalopolis with its platforms and its thousands of armored machines, but the city as a human idea, the very concept of people choosing to live densely together in a shared structure, a shared noise, a shared undertaking. The city was not particularly intelligent. It was not particularly efficient. It made an enormous amount of noise that went nowhere. It generated complexity far in excess of what was needed for any individual task. It was, from a certain elevation and in a certain light, frankly irrational, but it was impossible to destroy from the inside, because the inside was what made it dangerous. Voss had built his god in the city, using the city's machines, deploying the city's own architecture against it. He'd been brilliant at it. He'd gotten as far as brilliant gets when it operates in isolation from the small human textures, from the irrational warmth of a pilot naming her machine, from a sergeant who'd grown up enough to know the difference between 17 days and 17 days minus 1. The coffee was terrible. Morrow finished it anyway. "What do you want to do now?" Davy asked. He thought about the crow's nest, the railing, the city below him in the stormlight. the Striders moving in their terrible choreography. The moment just before the bolts fired, when he'd looked out at it all and understood that this was the problem with gods of any kind. Vosses, the cities, the old ones in the books Voss had read. They were, in the end, too large for the thing they were built to protect, too vast to notice the human scale, too elegant to account for the grip. I want, Morrow said, to do the paperwork, then get dinner, then sleep for approximately 11 hours. Davi looked at him. And then she said, and then he said, we go back to work. The city hummed outside the window, the cranes moved. The machines, all of them now piloted, all of them now with a human hand on the controls, moved through their ordinary work with the quiet reliability of things that have been brought back from a very strange place, and are glad to be doing what they were built for. Morrow put down his cup. He picked up the first of the 47 outstanding incident forms on his desk. He began to write.